In the year 63 BC, in a fortress above the Black Sea, one of the most formidable enemies Rome ever faced raised a cup of poison to his lips and did not die. He had spent a lifetime preparing for assassins from his youth. So, the ancient historians tell us, he had swallowed small doses of the deadliest toxins known to his world, training his body to survive what killed other men. And according to the ancient story, it worked too well. Now, with Roman legions closing in and his own son in revolt, the one death he chose for himself was the one death his body refused to give him. His name was Mithridates the Sixth of Pontus. Across roughly a quarter of a century, he fought 3 wars against Rome, and for 2,000 years, history has half forgotten him. Tonight, that changes. This is the whole story of a kingdom at the edge of the ancient world, and of the king who poisoned himself to survive. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. The cup is already raised. Chapter 1. The Edge of the Map. Every story needs a stage, and this one begins with a coastline that most people alive today have never seen. Picture the Black Sea, a vast body of water lying between Europe and Asia, so large that the first Greek sailors who entered it thought they had found another ocean. They named it, with a kind of nervous politeness, the Euxine, which means the hospitable sea. Ancient writers themselves noticed the irony in that name, because this was a sea of sudden storms, of fog that swallowed ships whole, and of far shores where a Greek sailor might meet peoples who had never heard a word of his language. Now travel along its southern coast, the coast that belongs today to the nation of Turkey. Here the land does something dramatic. A wall of mountains rises, almost straight out of the water. In places, the peaks climb past 10,000 feet, and their northern slopes catch the wet sea air and hold it, so that these mountainsides are green in a way that surprises travelers, expecting the dry hills of the Mediterranean. Rain and mist feed forests of beech and fir. Streams pour down through valleys thick with fruit trees. Even today, this coast grows tea and hazelnuts in enormous quantities. And in the ancient world, it was famous for timber, for iron, and for honey. This narrow, green, mountainous strip of coast, and the high country behind it, was the Kingdom of Pontus. The name comes simply from the Greek word for the sea, the kingdom by the sea. It is also, though we have not met him yet, the country that made Mithridates possible. Every strength he would eventually use against Rome, and every place he would run to when Rome came for him, is already here in this landscape, so it is worth walking it slowly before the story begins. Pontus was less one world than 2 worlds stitched together, and the seam between them ran along those mountains. Along the coast lay Greek cities, Sinope, sitting on a peninsula with harbours on both sides, one of the finest natural ports on the entire sea. Amisus, rich from trade in the wide river valleys behind it. Trapezus, far to the east, the last stop before the land of Colchis, where Greek legend placed the Golden Fleece. These cities had been founded centuries earlier by colonists from Miletus, a Greek city far to the south, and they looked outward, toward the water. Their people spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, minted Greek coins, and thought of themselves as members of the wide Greek world, even though they lived at its farthest edge. Behind the mountains lay something older and very different. The interior of Pontus was a high plateau of river valleys, temple estates, and village, and its ruling culture looked not west toward Greece, but east toward Persia. For 2 centuries, this land had been part of the Persian Empire, and Persian noble families had put down deep roots here. They held fortresses on crags above the valleys. They kept the old Persian religious traditions, honoring fire altars and gods of light, alongside powerful local deities. A moon god named Men, and a goddess named Ma, whose sanctuary at Comana was served, according to the ancient geographer Strabo, by thousands of temple servants. And we should be careful not to draw the line too cleanly. The division was never perfect. Beneath the Greek harbours and the Persian strongholds lived older Anatolian peoples, with their own languages, their own cults, and their own long memory of the land. Pontus was Greek on the shore and Persian in the highlands, but it was Anatolian in its bones. And all three worlds bled into each other at the edges, in the markets, in the temples, in the marriage beds. Still, the great fact stands: one kingdom, holding two civilizations in a single pair of hands, with mountain passes and river roads tying them together into something that had no exact copy anywhere else in the ancient world. We know this landscape unusually well for an inland kingdom of the ancient East, and we owe that luck to one man, Strabo, one of the greatest geographers antiquity produced. Was born in Amasea, a city of the Pontic interior, around the year 64 BC. Just as the events at the end of our story were unfolding, he grew up among these valleys. His own family had served the kings of Pontus, and by his own account, one of his ancestors had been close to Mithridates himself. When Strabo describes the fortress of Amasea, carved into a gorge above the Iris River, with the tombs of the early kings cut into the rock face, he is describing the view from his childhood. Through his eyes, we can still see the kingdom. Why does this geography matter so much? Because in this story, geography is destiny, and it explains the entire life of the man we are following tonight. Consider what this land offered an ambitious ruler. It offered wealth, timber for ships from the mountain forests, iron from the country of the Calibes, a people so famous for metalwork that one Greek word for steel carried their name, silver, salt, wax, and honey, fish from the sea in such abundance that Sinope grew rich on tuna alone, grain from the river valleys. This was not a poor frontier. This was a treasury waiting for someone to unlock it. It offered protection. To reach the Pontic heartland, an invading army had to cross mountain ranges, ford rivers, and march through narrow passes where a small force could hold off a large one. Fortresses stood on peaks throughout the interior, and the kings of Pontus used them to store treasure and shelter their families. An enemy could defeat a Pontic army in the field in a single afternoon. Digging a Pontic king out of these highlands was the work of years, as Rome would eventually learn at great cost. And it offered position. Pontus sat at the hinge of two worlds. From here, a ruler could trade and negotiate with the Greek cities scattered around the entire rim of the Black Sea, from the grain fields of Crimea in the north to the riverside markets of Colchis in the east. From here, he could also reach south, into the tangled politics of Asia Minor, where a dozen kingdoms and free cities jostled for advantage. A ruler of Pontus could present himself as a Greek king to the Greeks, and as a Persian king to the Persians, because in a real sense he was both. Hold that thought as the mountains slide past in the dark, because it is the key to everything that follows. The man at the center of tonight's story would claim descent from Persian royalty on one side and from the successors of Alexander the Great on the other. Whether every link in that family tree was real is something historians still debate, and we will weigh it honestly when we come to it. But the claim was only believable at all because of this land. Only in Pontus could a king wear both crowns at once and have the world take him seriously. There is one more thing to notice before we meet the kings themselves. In the 2nd century BC, while Pontus was still a regional kingdom minding its own affairs, The center of power in the Mediterranean was shifting. Far to the west, a republic centered on the city of Rome had defeated Carthage, humbled Macedonia, and begun reaching into the Greek East. Roman merchant, Roman tax companies, and eventually Roman armies were moving closer, decade by decade, to the Black Sea. Two systems were expanding toward each other. One was Roman, Western, and Republican. The other was the old world of Eastern kings, heirs to Persia and Alexander. Somewhere, at some point, they were going to meet. They met in Pontus. But before that collision, a family had to build this kingdom out of the wreckage of empires. It is one of the great survival stories of the ancient world, and it begins with a young man fleeing for his life with, according to the historian Appian, just 6 horsemen at his side. Chapter 2. The First Mithridatids. The Kingdom of Pontus was born from a manhunt. To understand it, we need to step back to the years after the death of Alexander the Great. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, and he left behind the largest empire the world had yet seen and no clear heir to rule it. What followed was one of the most ruthless power struggles in recorded history. His generals, men known as the successors, spent the next 40 years carving up his conquests and fighting each other for the pieces. Kingdoms rose and vanished in a single campaign season. Loyalty was a currency, and it was spent quickly. In this dangerous world lived a Persian nobleman named Mithridates. He was not yet a king. He was a young man from a family that had governed a small territory in northwestern Asia Minor under the old Persian Empire, a family that claimed descent from the highest Persian aristocracy, the circle connected to Darius the Great himself. Modern historians treat the details of that claim with caution. Since royal genealogies in the ancient world were often improved in the retelling, but the family was genuinely Persian, genuinely noble, and genuinely good at surviving, which in that era was the rarest talent of all. The young Mithridates served at the court of Antigonus, the One-Eyed, one of the most powerful of Alexander's former generals, and at that court, according to the account preserved by Appian, his life nearly ended before his story began. Antigonus grew suspicious of the young Persian. Some versions say a dream convinced the old general that Mithridates would one day threaten his power. Whatever the true reason, Antigonus decided to have him killed. Warning reached the young man in time. Ancient writers say it came from his friend Demetrius, the son of Antigonus himself, who could not bear to see his companion murdered and revealed the plot. And so, around the year 302 BC, Mithridates fled east with, in Appian's telling, 6 horsemen at his side, 6 riders, moving fast through the hill country of northern Asia Minor, with the power of a great warlord behind them. In Appian's telling, that is the tiny company from which the kingdom's founding legend begins. Mithridates made for exactly the kind of country we crossed in the last chapter. The rough highlands, where a fugitive with local roots could disappear and a hunter with an army could not follow. He took refuge in a mountain stronghold called Simiata, and there something remarkable happened. Instead of remaining a fugitive, he began to gather followers. The Persian noble families of the interior knew his name and his lineage. The local peoples needed protection in a collapsing world. Piece by piece, valley by valley, the refugee became a ruler. History remembers him, as he is usually numbered, as Mithridates the First, called Catists, a Greek word meaning the founder. There is a pattern here worth naming, because it will echo through this entire story like a distant drum. The family that would one day produce Rome's most stubborn enemy began with a man who survived a death sentence by running to the mountains and refusing to stay defeated. Flight, endurance, and return. The founding story of the dynasty is the same story its final king would live out, on a far larger stage, 200 years later. Whether the later kings consciously modelled themselves on the founder, no source can tell us. But the family clearly told this story about itself. And families have a way of becoming the stories they tell. The founder ruled for decades and passed his young kingdom to his heirs. And here, the record grows thin. The next several kings are little more than names and coins to us. But through the reigns of Ariobarzanes and the second and third Mithridates, the kingdom slowly thickened. It absorbed valleys. It made marriage alliances with the powerful Seleucid dynasty to the south, which meant the kings of Pontus could now add the blood of Alexander's successors to their Persian ancestry. The two crowns we spoke of earlier were being joined, marriage by marriage, into a single family tree. Then, in one of those moments that separate minor kingdoms from serious powers, a king of Pontus took the sea. His name was Pharnaces the First, and in the 180s BC, he did something his neighbours considered outrageous. He attacked and captured Sinope, the finest Greek port on the southern Black Sea coast. The historian Polybius records the diplomatic uproar that followed, with the island Republic of Rhodes sending envoys to complain, and a coalition of neighbouring kings eventually forcing Pharnaces to give back some of his other gains. But Sinope he kept, and keeping Sinope changed what Pontus was. A kingdom of the interior had become a kingdom of the coast. The Persian highlands and the Greek harbours now lay under one crown. Sinope became the royal capital, and the kings of Pontus began to present themselves in earnest as Greek monarchs, patrons of Greek temples and Greek festivals, while remaining Persian aristocrats in the old heartland. It was a balancing act, and for 3 generations they performed it well. One more turn of the wheel brings us to the edge of our main story. In the middle of the 2nd century BC, a king named Mithridates the Fifth, called Euergetes, the benefactor, ruled in Sinope. He read the direction of the wind clearly. The rising power in the world was Rome, and so he became Rome's friend. He sent ships and men to help Rome in its final war against Carthage. When Rome fought a brutal war against a pretender in Western Asia Minor, he helped again. Rome, in return, allowed him to expand his influence. He hired Greek officers, welcomed Greek culture, and married into the Seleucid royal line. By the standards of his dangerous neighbourhood, he was a success. And then, around the year 120 BC, at a banquet in his own palace at Sinope, someone put poison in his cup. We do not know who. Appian and other sources record the murder, but not the murderer. No ancient writer hands us a confession or a trial. Modern historians have pointed suspicion in several directions, including toward members of his own court and family. But suspicion is all it has ever been. What we know is that the benefactor died at his own table, among people he trusted, and that his death handed the kingdom to a boy of about 12 or 13 years old. That boy was his eldest son, Mithridates the Sixth. Hold the scene gently in your mind as this chapter closes. A palace above a Greek harbour, under a Persian dynasty. Lamplight on the water. A dead king on the floor of his own banquet hall. And somewhere in that palace, a child who has just learned, in the most direct way possible, the first great lesson of his life. The deadliest place in his world was not a battlefield. It was a dinner table. Chapter 3. A comet at his birth. Ancient writers could not agree on much about Mithridates the Sixth, but they agreed that the sky itself announced him. The Roman historian Justin whose work preserves an older and now lost history by a writer named Pompeius Trogus, records that a comet blazed over the east in the year of his birth, and again in the year he came to his throne. Justin says the light burned for weeks, so bright it seemed to set the sky on fire. Chinese court astronomers, on the other side of the world, recorded comets in this same era, in the 130s and 120s BC. And some modern scholars, including the historian Adrienne, have suggested that these records may line up with the Roman story. Others are more cautious, and honesty requires saying that the comet of the birth year cannot be proven, but something just as interesting can be said. The people of the East believed it. And in the ancient world, what people believed about a king was a form of power in itself, because a comet, in the traditions of Persia and the East, was not necessarily an omen of doom the way it often was in Rome. It could herald the coming of a great king, a world changer sent by the heavens. From the very beginning, before the boy had done anything at all, there were people ready to see him as a figure of destiny. Remember that, because Mithridates would spend his whole life feeding that belief, and it would serve him better than any army. We should admit at the outset that we do not know exactly when he was born. The ancient sources do not agree. Appian tells us he lived 68 or 69 years and reigned 57, which would place his birth around 132 BC. Other traditions push it a few years earlier. Throughout tonight's story, we will follow the earlier reckoning, which puts his birth around 135 BC. But you should hold the number loosely. It is the first small reminder of something this whole night will keep teaching us. Even the basic facts about this man come to us through a fog, and the fog is part of the story. He was born in Sinope, into the double inheritance we have been tracing for 2 chapters. Through his father, he claimed the blood of Persian kings, a line his court traced back to Darius the Great. Through his mother, a Seleucid princess named Laodice, he claimed descent from the Macedonian successors of Alexander. His very name carried the eastern half of that inheritance. Mithridates means given by Mithra, the ancient Persian god of light, of oaths, and of contracts, a Persian name, a Greek education, a Greek capital, a Persian heartland. He was, in one person, the whole strange kingdom we described at the start of the night. Think about what that inheritance actually meant for a boy growing up in the palace at Sinope. In the same day, he might hear Greek recited from Homer in a lesson room decorated with Greek columns, and then walk out to watch riders from the interior arrive with tribute. Men whose fathers had served Persian nobles and whose gods had names no Athenian would recognize. He would have learned early that different rooms required different faces. Historians have often noted how skillfully the adult Mithridates presented himself to different audiences, appearing as the champion of Greek freedom in the cities of Asia and as the heir of Persian kings to the peoples of the East. That skill did not appear from nowhere. It began as the ordinary bilingual childhood of a boy who belonged completely to 2 worlds and entirely to neither. His upbringing matched the ambition of his name. He was raised speaking Greek, trained in Greek literature and Greek athletics, and taught to ride and hunt in the Persian style, where a nobleman was measured by his horsemanship and his honesty. Ancient writers describe a boy of unusual physical strength and unusual appetite for learning, and even allowing for royal flattery. His later life makes both claims easy to believe. Later traditions credit him with a memory so retentive that he could address the many peoples of his empire in their own tongues, a claim modern historians treat as an exaggeration built on a real foundation. A king ruling a coastline of many languages would have needed at least some of them, and a court that wanted to celebrate him would naturally round the number up toward the miraculous. Then came the bonke, and the poison, and everything changed. His father was dead. Mithridates was perhaps 12 or 13. His younger brother was a child, and the kingdom passed into the hands of a regent, his own mother, Queen Laodice, who was to rule until her sons came of age. Consider what that regency actually was, because it is easy to hear the word queen and imagine safety. In the Hellenistic world, a regency was a period of legalized ambiguity. The kingdom belonged to a boy who could not enforce his ownership, and everyone in the palace knew it. Every noble family, every general, every court official had to make a private calculation about which heir would survive to reward them. In such an atmosphere, the safest thing a powerful person could do was to attach themselves to the more controllable child. And the young Mithridates was not the more controllable child. According to the tradition preserved by Justin and later writers, what followed was not a childhood, but a slow-motion assassination. The court, these accounts say, favoured the younger brother. The young Mithridates began to have accidents. Horses that should have been safe threw him. Hunting expeditions turned dangerous in ways that hunting should not, and meals became a daily gamble. Because the same court that had poisoned the father had every reason to poison the son. Here we need to be honest about our sources, because this is one of the places where legend and history braid together most tightly. The stories of the boy's persecution come to us from writers working generations later, and ancient historians loved a hunted prince the way modern audiences love an origin story. Some modern scholars accept the outline. Others suspect the dramatic details were polished in the telling. The broader atmosphere is much easier to accept than the individual stories. His father had been murdered at his own table. The succession was contested, and the palace of Sinope was a genuinely dangerous place for a boy whose existence blocked other people's ambitions. And it is here, in these poisoned years, that the tradition places the beginning of the strangest habit in ancient history. The boy, the story goes, began to protect himself. Small doses of toxins, taken deliberately, carefully, on by on, to teach his body to survive them. A little more each time. A private experiment conducted on himself, with his own life as the stake, resting on a simple and terrifying piece of logic. If poison was coming for him anyway, better to meet it on his own terms. Whether it truly began this early, no one can say. The story comes from the same late tradition as the rest of his childhood, and we will look closely, in the next chapter, at what he is said to have taken and at what modern knowledge makes of it. For now, notice only what this legend meant to the people who told it. In their eyes, the defining fact about this king was formed in fear, at a dinner table, by a child who chose study over flight. They remembered a boy who made his own body the laboratory and his own survival the experiment. There is one more thing the legend tells us, and it is easy to miss. A child who begins taking poison has already concluded that no adult in the palace will protect him. Whatever the medical truth of the story, that is a portrait of total isolation. Every relationship this man would form for the rest of his life, with wives, with generals, with allies, with his own children, would be built on the foundation laid in those years. And it was a foundation of watchfulness. It explains a great deal about the cruelties still ahead of us in this story. It does not excuse a single one of them. By his mid-teens, the sources tell us, the pressure in Sinope became unbearable, and the young prince vanished from the capital. Where he went, and what he became in the years he was gone, is a story wrapped in even more legend than his childhood. It is also the story of how a hunted boy turned himself into the most dangerous man in the East. The road into that wilderness runs inland, out of the harbour light, into the mountains we already know. Chapter 4. The Wilderness Years. For roughly 7 years, the heir to the throne of Pontus simply disappears from history. The tradition, preserved by Justin, says the young Mithridates left Sinope in his mid-teens and spent the next 7 years living wild in the mountains of the interior. The accounts describe a prince who slept in the open in all weathers, who hunted his own food and outran the game he chased, who moved from stronghold to stronghold among the noble families of the highlands, and who hardened his body into something that later amazed even his enemies, Roman writers, who had every reason to diminish him, still recorded with reluctant awe that he could ride enormous distances in a single day. And Plutarch preserves the claim that he could drive a chariot of 16 horses, a detail that sounds like legend and may well be. Now, as promised, let us be honest about what we are looking at, because this is exactly the kind of story that grows in the telling. 7 is a suspicious number. It is the number fairy tales use. A prince in exile, wandering the wilderness, gathering strength for his return, is one of the oldest story shapes in the world, and ancient audiences would have recognized it instantly, because it echoes the youth of Cyrus the Great of Persia and of other legendary kings. Some modern historians read these 7 years as court legend, polished after the fact to give the king a proper heroic origin. Others, including Adrienne in her biography of Mithridates, called The Poison King, point out that the core of the story is entirely plausible. The palace was genuinely dangerous. The highlands were genuinely loyal to his father's line. A threatened heir genuinely needed to be somewhere his mother's court could not reach. And there was no better place than the fortress country where his dynasty was born. The truth probably lies somewhere in the braid. A real exile, remembered through the lens of legend. And we will simply tell you what the sources say and let you weigh it in the dark. What matters for our story is what those years produced, whether they were spent exactly as the legends describe or not. The man who returned from them was real. His skills were real, and the strangest of those skills would follow him to the last hour of his life. Somewhere in these years, the tradition says, the experiment that began in the palace became a discipline. Mithridates studied poison the way other princes studied rhetoric. The sources describe him seeking out knowledge wherever it lived. Folk healers in mountain villages. The herb lore of the peoples around the Black Sea, including, later in his life, contact with tribes whose archers were said to tip their arrows with venom, Greek medical texts, and the pharmacology of the East. Pliny the Elder, the Roman encyclopedist, writing about a century and a half later, records that Mithridates became the most learned man of his age in poisons and their remedies, and that he tested antidotes not only on himself, but, in the grimmer versions of the story, on condemned prisoners. If that last detail is true, it belongs on the dark side of his ledger, and we will not pretend otherwise. His method, as the ancient accounts describe it, was the one he had begun as a boy. Small doses, taken daily, increased gradually, toxins layered one on top of another over years, and alongside the toxins, an antidote, a compound of dozens of ingredients blended into a single daily preparation that the ancient world would later call Mithridatium. After him, we will meet that famous mixture again at the very end of our story, because it outlived him by an astonishing margin. Does any of this actually work? It is a fair question to ask across 20 centuries, and the honest answer has 2 halves. The practice of building tolerance through repeated small exposures is real enough that modern toxicology borrowed his name for it. It is called Mithridatism. For certain biological toxins, under certain conditions, repeated exposure can produce a limited resistance. Though attempting such a thing is dangerous and unpredictable, and no sane person should try it, and the limits are hard. The approach does nothing against many poisons, including metallic poisons like arsenic, which accumulate in the body rather than teaching it anything. And a tolerance built against one substance says nothing about the next. The comparison with modern medicine should not be pushed far. Vaccination and allergy treatment work through carefully studied mechanisms of their own, and they do not descend from a king swallowing toxins. If the accounts of Mithridates are accurate at all, his practice was an uncertain mixture of tolerance, antidote, and experiment, whose effects would have depended entirely on the substance involved. So the picture the legends paint, a king immune to all poison, is almost certainly larger than the truth. What the evidence actually supports is something narrower and, in its own way, just as interesting. This was a king who cultivated, over decades, the reputation of being exceptionally difficult to poison. In a world where the cup was the assassin's favorite weapon, that reputation alone was armor, whether his blood ever matched his legend. Every rival who considered poisoning him had to wonder, and consider what such a discipline would cost a person. If the tradition is even half true, not one dramatic act of courage, but a small deliberate act of fear, repeated every morning, for years, then for decades. It is the patience that impresses more than the daring. Keep that patience in view. Rome was about to learn what it looked like on a battlefield. Around the year 113 BC, give or take a year or two, the waiting ended. The prince came down from the highlands, and he did not come alone. The loyalty of the interior, the fortress families, the officers who had served his father, all of it had gathered around him during the silent years. Sinope opened its gates. The regency of his mother collapsed, and the account preserved by Justin tells us how the new king, roughly 22 years old, settled his family business. His mother, Queen Laodice, was imprisoned, and she died in confinement. His younger brother, the rival heir, disappears from the record, and the sources indicate he did not survive the new reign. Ancient rumor, never proven, would later whisper about other family deaths as well. There is no way to soften this, and we will not try. The hunted boy had learned the lessons of the palace perfectly, and the first thing he did with power was to make certain no one could do to him what had been done to his father. The ancient world rarely offered kings a gentler path, but even by its standards, the house of Pontus was a hard house. Comet, the sources say, burned over his coronation, just as one had burned over his birth. The king was on his throne. He was young, brilliant, ruthless, and wrapped in a legend that said he could not be killed the ordinary way. Now he needed an empire. Chapter 5. King of the Black Sea. Here is a fact about Mithridates that surprises people who know only the ending of his story. Before he ever fought Rome, he spent close to 25 years building, and for most of that time he was careful never to give Rome a reason to look at him twice. Understand the situation the young king inherited. Pontus was prosperous but modest, one middling kingdom among the many that crowded Asia Minor. To the west lay Bithynia, a rival kingdom with its own ambitious ruler. To the south lay Cappadocia, ruled by relatives and rivals in roughly equal measure. And beyond them all lay the shadow. In the years around Mithridates' rise, Rome had accepted control of the old kingdom of Pergamum in western Asia Minor, whose last king had died and willed his realm to the Roman people. That inheritance became the Roman province of Asia, and it meant the Republic was no longer a distant power across the sea. Roman governors, Roman soldiers, and above all Roman tax companies now stood a few hundred miles from Sinope. A reckless king would have picked a fight. Mithridates turned his back on the whole tangle and looked north, across the water. And that decision tells you how his mind worked. The opportunity came to him, which is how the best opportunities usually arrive. On the northern shore of the Black Sea, in and around the peninsula we now call Crimea, stood old Greek cities, Chersonesus, and the cities of the Cimmerian Bosporus. Among them, they were rich, they were ancient, and they were in trouble. Nomadic peoples of the steppe, whom the Greek sources call Scythians, were pressing on them season after season, raiding their farmland and demanding tribute. The cities had appealed for help before, to anyone who would listen. Now they appealed to the rising king across the sea. Mithridates said yes. He sent an army north under a general named Diophantus, a commander from Sinope whose campaigns we know about through a piece of extraordinary luck. The city of Chersonesus set up a public inscription in his honor, carved in stone, and that stone survived. Archaeologists recovered it. And so, in a story where most of our evidence comes filtered through Roman enemies, we can for once read the friendly version. Written by the people Diophantus actually defended. The inscription and the historical sources together describe a masterpiece of a campaign. Diophantus, with a compact professional force, repeatedly defeated much larger Scythian armies, relieved the besieged cities, put down a dangerous local uprising, and organized the whole northern coast under Pontic protection. Chersonesus, in its inscription, presented the intervention as a rescue, and for a city that had watched steppe riders burn its farmland. The gratitude was surely real, but we should read the stone the way we read all official gratitude. Pontic protection also meant Pontic garrisons, Pontic tribute, and political dependence on a king across the sea. Rescue and conquest, in the ancient world, were often the same event described in two tones of voice. The kingdom of the Cimmerian Bosporus passed into Mithridates' hands, and with it came the thing that changed the arithmetic of everything that followed. Grain. The black earth country behind the northern coast was one of the great breadbaskets of the ancient world. Ancient accounts, including figures preserved by Strabo, describe enormous quantities of grain and silver flowing south to Sinope as tribute from the new territories. Add the fish trade, the timber, the traffic of the steppe ports, and the customs revenue of the straits, and the modest kingdom of our first chapter was becoming something Rome had not seen in the East for a long time. A power with deep pockets and its own food supply. The East Coast followed. Colchis, the fabled land of the Golden Fleece at the far end of the sea, came under Pontic control, with its timber, its linen, its gold-bearing rivers, and its harbours linking the trade of the steppe to the markets of the south. Armenia Minor, a strategic highland on his eastern flank, was added as well. Ring by ring, the shores of the sea were being tied to Sinope, until a man standing in the king's harbour could imagine, and his court poets surely did imagine, the whole Black Sea as a Pontic lake. The reality was looser than the poetry. He held the key points. Not every mile of shore, but even the loose version was more than any ruler in that region had held together for generations. Then he secured the deepest alliance of his life. To his southeast, in the high country beyond the Euphrates, a new king had taken the throne of Armenia around the year 95 BC. His name was Tigranes, a forceful ruler with ambitions pointing east and south toward the crumbling Seleucid world. In the years that followed, Mithridates gave Tigranes his daughter Cleopatra in marriage, and the two kings became partners in a pact that would survive crisis after crisis for roughly 3 decades. Notice the design of it. Their ambitions pointed in different directions, so they did not compete, and each covered the other's flank. Alliances between ancient kings were usually worth less than the stone they were carved on. This one held through disasters that broke every other bond in the region. And near the end of our story, it will, for a time, save Mithridates' life. The map, as it stood by the early 90s BC, is the quiet argument of this chapter. Rome saw a friendly, careful Eastern king who sent polite embassies and stayed out of trouble. The map showed something else. A ring of territory and influence around most of the Black Sea. A treasury swollen with northern grain and silver. A fleet growing in the shipyards of Sinope and Amisus. A marriage alliance binding the strongest independent power of the East to his side. And a reputation spreading through the Greek cities of Asia. Of a king who protected Greeks. A new Alexander born under a comet. None of it, on its own, was a challenge to Rome. All of it together was a loaded weapon. What was still missing was the collision, and the collision would come the way collisions usually do. Not from grand strategy, but from a squabble over a mid-sized kingdom, pushed past the breaking point by the ambitions of a few Roman officials who treated the East as a thing to be harvested. Chapter 6. The Collision Course. Great wars rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as small problems. And the small problem that set Rome and Pontus on their collision course was a landlocked kingdom that most people today have never heard of. Cappadocia, a high, dry plateau south of Pontus, famous for horses and not much else, ruled by a dynasty tangled with the Pontic royal family through generations of marriage. On paper, it was independent. In practice, whoever controlled Cappadocia controlled the southern approaches to Pontus. And Mithridates could read that map as clearly as we can. So, through the last years of the 2nd century BC, he played chess there. He worked through his sister, who was married to the Cappadocian king. When that king died, and ancient sources point at Pontic involvement in the death, he worked through her son. When the nephew turned against him, Mithridates removed him too. Appian and Justin describe a meeting where the king of Pontus greeted his nephew with an embrace while carrying a hidden dagger, and the young man died. Mithridates then placed one of his own sons on the Cappadocian throne under a borrowed royal name. It is tempting, by this point in the night, to soften a figure we have followed since childhood, and this is the place to resist the temptation. The man who was hailed as a protector of Greeks in the north was also a man who used family members as chess pieces and discarded them when the game required it. Both things were true at once. The ancient world produced many rulers like this, but few who were as good at it. If Rome had done nothing, Mithridates might be remembered today mainly as a gifted and sinister dynastic operator. But Rome noticed. The Kingdom of Bithynia, Pontus's western rival, ran to the Senate with complaints, and Rome issued its ruling. Cappadocia was to be free, with a king of its own choosing. Mithridates' son was out. A Cappadocian noble named Ariobarzanes was installed with Roman blessing, and Mithridates obeyed. Notice that, because it matters for how we judge what came later. For years, every time Rome pushed, he pulled back, protested, maneuvered, and waited. He used allies to do what he could not do openly. And when his son-in-law, Tigranes, swept into Cappadocia and expelled the Roman client king, Mithridates could truthfully say that his own soldiers had never crossed the border. Around this time, roughly the year 99 BC, one of history's most interesting conversations took place. The Roman general Gaius Marius, the most famous soldier of the Republic, travelled through the East and Plutarch tells us he met Mithridates face to face. Plutarch attributes to Marius a single surviving sentence from that meeting: either be greater than the Romans, or do what they command. Whether those were the exact words spoken on the road that day, no one can promise. But the sentence is worth sitting with anyway, the way Mithridates must have sat with it, because it compresses the entire Roman worldview into one line. In Roman eyes, there was no such thing as an equal. There were subjects, and there were enemies, and a king who wanted a third option was welcome to try to become greater than Rome. It is hard to imagine words better designed to teach an intelligent man that patience had a time limit. Meanwhile, in the Roman province of Asia next door, Rome was teaching a version of the same lesson to millions of ordinary people. And this part of the story comes to us partly from Roman pens, written with visible embarrassment. Rome did not so much govern Asia as harvest it. The Republic sold the right to collect provincial taxes to private companies of investors, the Publicani, who paid Rome up front and then squeezed the province for profit. Their agents assessed, collected, and enforced, with interest on arrears that could swallow a family's land in a few bad seasons. Cities borrowed against their public buildings, and the ancient tradition preserves darker pictures still. Later accounts describe debtors driven to sell their possessions, and, in the bleakest tellings, even their children. A picture of exploitation painted by ancient writers to shock, and impossible now to measure precisely. What we can measure is the outcome. Even Roman voices, including Cicero a generation later, admitted how deeply the provincials had come to hate the system. When we reach the horror of the next chapter, this hatred is the fuel it burned. None of it excuses what happened. All of it explains why it was possible. The final push came from a Roman named Manius Aquilius. He arrived in the east around 90 BC with a commission to restore, once again, the kings Mithridates and Tigranes had displaced, and Mithridates, once again, backed down. But Aquilius wanted more than restoration. Ancien sources, especially Appian, describe what happened next about as plainly as ancient sources ever speak. Aquilius pressed Nicomedes, the young king of Bithynia, who owed large sums to Roman lenders, to raid Pontic territory, so that the debts could be paid from plunder. Nicomedes appears to have had little appetite for the war. By every sign in the sources, Mithridates did not want it yet either. Aquilius arranged it anyway. Bithynian troops crossed into Pontic land and plundered it. Mithridates did not strike back. Instead, he sent an ambassador to the Roman commissioners with a question that deserves to be more famous than it is. If Rome and Pontus were friends, why was Rome's client raiding his kingdom? And would Rome restrain him? The Roman answer, as Appian records it, was that Mithridates must not make war on Nicomedes. Not a denial, not an apology, a warning addressed to the victim. We cannot see into the king's mind at that moment, and we will not pretend to. What we can see is the ledger as he must have seen it. He was now past 40. He had obeyed for a quarter of a century, and obedience had brought Roman clients to his borders and Roman creditors to his neighbours' thrones. He had a full treasury, a fleet, a ring of territory around most of a sea, and an army that had been drilling for years. Ancient sources give numbers for that army that are almost certainly exaggerated, but even cautious, modern estimates make it one of the largest forces the East had raised in generations. In 89 BC, he moved. His son swept the Roman clients out of Cappadocia. His main armies came down through the valleys into Bithynia and Western Asia Minor, and the Roman scratch forces assembled against him broke. One after another, Nicomedes fled. The province of Asia, one of the richest possessions Rome held, opened its gates, city by city, and many opened them cheering, because to the taxed and the indebted, the invader looked like liberation. And Manius Aquilius, the man who had lit the fuse, was captured. What Mithridates did to him became one of the most repeated stories of the ancient world. Appian records that the king paraded Aquilius through the cities, and then executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. Whether every detail happened exactly so, the story spread because its message required no translation anywhere on earth. This is what Rome came for. Let Rome drink it. For the Greek cities of Asia, watching a Roman commissioner die of the very greed that had ruined them, it was intoxicating theatre. But theatre has a logic of its own. Mithridates had now made himself the one enemy Rome could never quietly forgive. And some historians have argued that this was precisely the point. Every city that cheered was now his accomplice. And in the following year, he would ask those cities to prove it, in blood. Chapter 7. The Asiatic Vespers. What happened in the year 88 BC has no gentle version, and we will not invent one. Mithridates now held Western Asia Minor, but he understood exactly how fragile that hold was. The cities had welcomed him, but cities that change sides once can change sides twice. Rome was distracted by a brutal war inside Italy against its own rebellious allies. Yet everyone knew the distraction was temporary. Sooner or later, the legions would come east. When they did, every city in Asia would have to choose, and Roman residents in every one of those cities would be waiting to open the gates. So Mithridates designed a solution of appalling clarity. If the cities could not be trusted to stay loyal, he would make them too guilty to be forgiven. Secret letters went out from the king to the civic authorities of the cities of Asia, all carrying the same instruction and the same date, 30 days from the sending. On a single appointed day, the cities were to kill their Roman and Italian residents, men, women, and children. The dead were to be left unburied. Their property was to be divided, half to the killers, half to the royal treasury. Slaves who killed their Roman masters were promised freedom. Debtors who killed their Roman creditors were promised relief from their debts. Look at the engineering of that decree, because its cold intelligence is the most frightening thing about it. Every clause recruited a different motive. Greed, freedom, and debt were all pointed at the same target on the same day. And the requirement that the killing be public and communal meant that when Rome returned, no participating city could claim clean hands. Guilt was the design. Later, historians have sometimes called this event the Asiatic Vespers, borrowing the name of a medieval massacre, and it remains one of the most chilling political acts that antiquity records. On the appointed day, across many of the cities under his control, the order was obeyed. The ancient accounts, above all Appian's, preserve scenes from that day, and a few are enough. In Ephesus, people were torn from the sanctuary of the Temple of Artemis, one of the most sacred refuges in the Greek world, and killed. In Pergamum, those who clung to the statues of the gods were shot down with arrows where they clung. In Adramutium, people who fled into the sea were followed into the water. In Caunus, the sources say, children were killed before their mothers, and the mothers after them. Sanctuary, the oldest and most universal mercy of Greek religion, was refused in city after city, and that refusal tells us this was policy, not frenzy. Not every community joined. Some cities and islands resisted the order or sheltered the hunted. And Rhodes, standing off the coast with its fleets, defied the king outright and never fell to him. The picture was not uniform. But the participation was wide enough and public enough to do exactly what it was designed to do. How many died? The ancient sources give two figures. A tradition, preserved by Valerius, Maximus, and Memnon, transmits the number 80,000. Plutarch, writing about the aftermath, gives 150,000. Modern historians treat both figures with deep caution, as they treat most large round numbers from antiquity. And some argue the true count was considerably lower. We cannot resolve it tonight, and we will not pretend to. But whatever the real total, the surviving evidence points to killing on a very large scale. Tens of thousands of civilians, in a coordinated action, across an entire province, at the hands of their own neighbours, on the instruction of one man. It is worth standing still here, in the quiet, and refusing the comfort of distance. The people who died were not the tax companies. The publicani system was owned and financed from Italy by wealthy investors, while many of the actual Romans and Italians living in Asia were traders, craftsmen, lenders, families. Some settled for generations. Some married into the very cities that killed them. The hatred that made the massacre possible was real, and we spent the last chapter tracing where it came from. But hatred aimed at a system landed on human beings, as it usually does. If this story were a simple tale of a liberator against an empire, tonight's chapter would not exist. It does exist, and any honest telling of Mithridates has to carry it the whole rest of the way. And here is the hard historical question the massacre forces on us. Was it madness? Or did it work? In the short term, and it is uncomfortable to say, it largely worked as designed. The cities that had taken part were now bound to Mithridates by shared guilt. And for the moment, the order made defection far more dangerous than loyalty. The financial shock reached Rome itself. So much Roman investment was tied up in Asian tax contracts and loans that ancient writers describe a credit crisis in the city in these years. And some modern historians, Adrienne among them, have argued that the massacre effectively transferred the wealth of the Roman East into the war chest of Pontus overnight. The connection between the two events is an argument, not a proven chain, but the timing is hard to ignore. Then weigh what he bought against what he paid. Because this is the moment the entire war changed its nature. Before the massacre, Rome was fighting a war it had largely provoked, over provinces, against a king, and wars like that could end in treaties. After the massacre, Rome was fighting the man it held responsible for the murder of its citizens by the tens of thousands, and that quarrel could only end at a graveside. For the rest of his life, in one form or another, Roman commanders would operate on a single understanding: there is no peace while he lives. Mithridates had wanted to make retreat impossible for the cities of Asia. He had also made it impossible for himself, somewhere in a palace in Pergamum, where he now held court as liberator of the East. The king, who had spent a lifetime armoring himself against the poisoned cup, had mixed a poison of a different kind, and had drunk it with his own hands. From this day forward, the man who had waited 25 years for his war was locked inside it until death. That same year, as if the East had not seen enough, he reached across the Aegean. The island of Delos, a hub of Roman trade, was struck, and thousands more Italians died there. Athens, the most famous city in the Greek world, declared for him, and his armies and fleets crossed into Greece itself. He now stood at the height of every power a king could hold. An empire around the Black Sea, a province bound to him by guilt, the treasury of the East, the glamour of a liberator in every city that hated Rome. And in Italy, the republic he had challenged was choosing the man to send against him. The choice fell on a patrician general with cold eyes and a genius for war. A man history remembers as Sulla. Rome was done watching. Chapter 8. Sulla and the burning of Athens. The man Rome sent east was, in his own way, as extraordinary as the man he was sent to destroy, and the war between them would be decided as much by what was happening behind each of them as by what happened between them. Lucius Cornelius Sulla came from an old patrician family that had fallen into poverty and obscurity, and he had clawed his way back up through talent, charm, and a coldness that unsettled even his allies. Plutarch, who wrote his biography, describes a man of strange contradictions, golden-haired and piercing-eyed, easy company at a dinner table and without mercy in the field. By 88 BC, he had earned the Eastern Command through decades of proven soldiering. And then, before he ever sailed, the command was taken from him. Politics in Rome had turned violent, and a rival faction transferred the war against Mithridates to the aging Gaius Marius, the same Marius who had once told Mithridates to be greater than the Romans or obey them. Sulla's answer changed Roman history forever. He turned his legions around and marched them on Rome itself. The first Roman general ever to take the city with a Roman army. He retook his command at sword point, settled affairs with executions, and sailed east, leaving behind a capital that hated him and would, within months, fall to his enemies. That is the strange shape of the war that followed. Sulla arrived in Greece in 87 BC, commanding 5 legions, with no fleet worth the name, no money from home, and a government behind him that had declared him an outlaw. He was, in a sense, a renegade fighting a private war with public soldiers. He could not afford a long war. He could not afford a defeat. He could not even fully afford a victory if it took too many years. Mithridates, by contrast, had the treasury of the East, but Mithridates was commanding from across the Aegean, through subordinates, and that distance would cost him. The Pontic cause in Greece centered on Athens. The city had declared for Mithridates under a leader named Adrienne, and the great fortified port of Piraeus was held by the king's best general, Archelaus, supplied freely by sea. Sulla did what Sulla always did. He chose the hardest target and attacked it without pause. The siege of Athens and Piraeus consumed the better part of a year, and the accounts of it in Plutarch and Appian are grim reading. Sulla stripped the sacred groves of the Academy and the Lyceum, where Plato and Aristotle had once taught, to build his siege engines. Short of funds, he took treasure from the sanctuaries of Olympia, Epidaurus, and Delphi, remarking, in the tradition Plutarch preserves, that the gods who kept filling his hands were clearly on his side. Inside Athens, famine reached the point where the sources describe people boiling leather for food. And worse, Aristean held out, and sent envoys who made speeches about the glorious past of Athens, to which Sulla replied, in Plutarch's telling, that Rome had not sent him there to learn history, but to subdue rebels. Picture the city in those last weeks, the lamps going out district by district as the oil ran low, the silence of a marketplace with nothing left to sell, winter rain on the long walls, and beyond them, the sound of Roman axes in the sacred groves. On the first day of March, in 86 BC, the walls were breached, and Sulla let his army loose. Plutarch says the blood ran through the streets of the district, called the Ceramicus, and out through the city gates. At last, the sources tell us, Sulla halted the killing, saying he forgave the living for the sake of the dead, sparing the city for the fame of its ancestors. Athens survived, politically broken and deeply scarred, It is one of history's bleak ironies that the city of Pericles was sacked by a man who genuinely admired it, on behalf of a republic that claimed to be civilization's guardian, because it had gambled on a king who claimed to be Greece's liberator. Piraeus fell next, and its famous arsenals burned. Now came the battles that decided the war in Greece, and they deserve a moment of honest wonder, because on paper they should not have gone the way they went. At Hierone, in Boeotia, in 86 BC, Sulla's army met the Pontic host under Archelaus. The ancient sources claim the Romans were outnumbered several times over, and while modern historians treat such ratios cautiously, no one doubts the disparity was real. The Pontic army was a spectacle of the Old East. Scythed chariots, bronze-shielded phalanxes, cavalry in gilded armour. Sulla's legionaries were something newer and plainer. Professionals who dug trenches and planted palisades and killed at close quarters without ceremony. The scythed chariots, terrifying in reputation, were funneled into prepared ground and destroyed. The phalanx, magnificent and rigid, was broken. Appian transmits a casualty claim so lopsided that Sulla himself is the obvious source of it, and we should say so plainly. The victor wrote the arithmetic, but the outcome is not in dispute. The Pontic army in Greece was shattered. Mithridates sent another army across the sea. In 85 BC, at Orchomenus, on open ground, suited to cavalry, it found Sulla again. Plutarch preserves the scene that became legend. When his soldiers broke and ran before the Pontic horse, Sulla seized a standard, pushed through the fugitives toward the enemy, and shouted that when men asked where they had betrayed their general, they should answer, "At Orchomenus." The line held. The trenches did their slow work. The second Pontic army was destroyed as completely as the first. 2 battles, 2 annihilations, and 1 lesson that will hang over the rest of our story. Money can raise an army, and Mithridates had more money than anyone. But Rome's deepest advantage was never a general or a treasury. It was a system that produced disciplined infantry in quantity and never stopped producing it. Beating Rome once meant another army was already forming. Any king who fought Rome was fighting a factory. Meanwhile, the war was collapsing behind both men at once. In Asia, the liberation had curdled. As loyalty wavered, the king's governance grew harsher, with purges, confiscation, and repressions that made some cities remember Roman tax collectors almost fondly. A second Roman army, sent by Sulla's enemies in Rome under a commander named Fimbria, arrived in Asia and campaigned savagely, defeating Pontic forces and very nearly capturing the king himself on the coast. In an episode where a Roman admiral's refusal to cooperate with Fimbria let the great prize slip away by sea, and Sulla needed to go home, where his enemies held Italy. So the two exhausted enemies met. In 85 BC, at Dardanus, near the ruins of Troy, a setting so heavy with symbolism that ancient writers could not resist it. Europe and Asia making terms within sight of their oldest war. The terms Sulla offered were, given the ocean of blood behind them, astonishingly light. Mithridates would surrender his conquests, hand over 70 ships, and pay an indemnity. And in return, he would keep his Kingdom of Pontus and be named a friend and ally of Rome. Appian records the disbelief in Sulla's own camp. Soldiers, asking how the author of the massacre of 88 could sail home a Roman ally. Sulla's answer was the truth. He did not have time to dig Mithridates out of Pontus, because he had a civil war to win. No written treaty survives from Dardanus, and scholars have long debated how formally the settlement was ever ratified. What is certain is that both men treated it as provisional. It was a pause between rounds, agreed by two fighters who each intended to finish the other later. Sulla sailed west to conquer his own country, which he did, with proscription lists that murdered thousands of Roman citizens, and he died in his bed a few years afterward, having resigned supreme power voluntarily. One of history's strangest exits. Mithridates sailed home to Sinope, beaten but intact, to a kingdom still wealthy, still fortified, still his. Imagine that homecoming, the same harbour where his father was poisoned, the same rock tombs of the old kings watching from the gorge upriver. He was roughly 50 years old, and everything he had built beyond his borders was gone. A reasonable man might have concluded that the experiment was over, that Rome could be resisted but not beaten, and that the remaining years should be spent securing what survived. Mithridates concluded that he had lost a campaign, not a war, and that next time he would fight it differently. Chapter 9. The Uneasy Decade. What followed was not peace. It was a little more than a decade of armed preparation between wars, and it deserves a chapter of its own, because this stretch of years is where the struggle took on a shape that feels uncomfortably modern. A war fought without battles, through proxies, pirates, deniable raids, and alliances stretching across the whole map. The first flare came almost immediately, and it came from the Roman side. Sulla had left a lieutenant named Lucius Licinius Murena in charge of Roman forces in Asia, an ambitious man in a hurry for a triumph. The settlement of Dardanus, remember, existed mostly as an understanding, and Murena chose to treat it as optional. In 83 BC, on thin pretexts, he marched into Pontic territory and plundered it, including, the sources note, the treasuries of a sanctuary. Mithridates did something that should complicate any simple picture of him as a warmonger. He protested to Rome and waited. Only when Murena raided again the following year did the king strike back, and he beat the Roman force decisively enough that Sulla himself sent word ordering Murena to stop, because Rome was in no condition for a second Eastern war. This brief embarrassment is counted by historians as the Second Mithridatic War, and its chief significance is what each side learned. Rome learned that Pontus still had teeth. Mithridates learned, one more time, that Roman commanders on a frontier made their own law, and that any peace with the Republic lasted exactly as long as Roman politics wanted it to. So he prepared, and the preparation of these years shows us the same mind we met in the poison chapters. Patient, systematic, willing to learn from failure. He rebuilt his army, and he rebuilt it Roman, the gorgeous, doomed host of Chaeronea, with its gilded cavalry and scythed chariots, was not reassembled. Appian and Plutarch tell us the new Pontic infantry was drilled and equipped in the Roman style, in disciplined, heavy units, many of them trained by actual Romans, because Rome's civil wars were now exporting their losers, and the losers came east. Officers from the defeated Marian faction, men with legionary experience and nothing left to lose in Italy, took service with the king, the factory that produced Roman soldiers. It turned out, occasionally shipped its products to the enemy. Consider what that decision cost him in pride, because it is the most revealing thing he did in these years. The armies of Chaeronea had been a statement about who he was. The scythed chariots came from the world of Darius and Xerxes. The gilded cavalry announced a king in the great Eastern tradition, and every Greek city that watched those columns pass understood exactly which inheritance was being displayed. To dismantle that and rebuild in the image of the enemy was to admit, in public and in metal, that the old world had lost. Many rulers cannot do this. They lose a war and rebuild the same army, slightly larger, because the army is not only a tool, but a mirror. Mithridates broke the mirror, whatever else the man was. He could look at a defeat without flinching and take from it the one lesson that hurt most. He also reached across the whole Roman world for partners. In Spain, at the far western end of the Mediterranean, a brilliant renegade Roman general named Sertorius was leading a rebel Roman government in exile, defeating army after army sent against him. Mithridates opened negotiations with him, king to rebel, across the entire length of the sea. The bargain, as the ancient sources describe it, traded Pontic gold and ships for Sertorian military advisors and recognition of Pontic claims in the east. Plutarch preserves the detail that Sertorius, even as a rebel, refused to concede Roman provincial territory in Asia, a piece of stubborn Roman pride that reportedly drew from Mithridates a wry remark about what commands the man would issue if he ever sat in Rome. Think about the physical reality of that alliance for a moment, because it is easy to say the words and miss the distance. A message from Sinope to Sertorius in Spain had to cross the length of the Mediterranean, through waters patrolled by Rome, in ships that sailed only in season, carried by men who could be captured, bribed, or drowned. Each exchange took months. An answer to a question asked in spring might arrive after the fighting season had ended. And yet the negotiations happened. Envoys crossed, and terms were argued over. It is one of the quiet marvels of the ancient world. Two enemies of Rome at opposite ends of it, trying to synchronize a war across 3,000 miles of water with no faster messenger than a wooden hull and a favorable wind. And then there were the pirates. During these same years, the fleets of Cilician pirates grew from a nuisance into a power, raiding coasts, strangling shipping lanes, eventually growing bold enough to strike Italy itself. Ancient writers, including Appian, connect Mithridates to these fleets, describing encouragement, employment, and shared enemies. Here we should be careful, because it is tempting to draw all these threads into a single grand design, with the old king at the center of a web spanning the whole Mediterranean. And later, Roman accounts sometimes portrayed it exactly that way. The truth is harder to recover. How much coordination really existed between Sinope, Spain, and the pirate coasts? No surviving source can tell us precisely. What we can say is that Mithridates had learned to think in terms of Rome's whole system rather than his own border, and that every force bleeding Rome anywhere found, at the very least, his goodwill, and often his gold. He could not outproduce the Roman factory. He could help stretch it thin, give that strategy its due, and then be honest about its flaw. It depended on timing, on Spain and the pirates and Pontus pressing Rome in the same years. And timing was the one thing he could not command. Sertorius's rebellion began to buckle under a young Roman commander named Pompey, and by the early 70s BC, Sertorius was murdered by his own officers. The western fire went out just as the eastern one was being lit. There is one more thing worth noticing about this decade, and it concerns the man rather than the strategy. He was in his 50s now. He had ruled for more than 30 years. He had a full treasury and a kingdom at peace, and the mathematics of the age said plainly that he would not live to fight a long war and win it. Other kings in his position made a different choice. Some accepted client status and kept their crowns. Some married their daughters into the Roman order and died wealthy. That road was open to him, and it stayed open for years, while he chose the harder one instead. Whether that was foresight, because he was convinced Rome would come for Pontus, eventually, no matter what he did, or whether it was something less rational, a refusal built into him during those poisoned years in the palace, is a question the sources cannot answer, and each listener will weigh differently. Because in 75 or 74 BC, depending on which source we follow. The fuse finally burned down. And it burned down in the most familiar place imaginable, Bithynia. The neighbouring kingdom whose quarrels with Pontus had started the first war, now ended the peace without an army moving. Its king, Nicomedes, died childless, and he did what the last king of Pergamum had done 2 generations earlier. He willed his entire kingdom to the Roman people. Look at the map through the eyes of Sinope as that news arrived. Rome was no longer a power with a province to the southwest. Rome now inherited the land along the western border of Pontus. The straits that were the gateway of the Black Sea, the mouth of the sea itself. Every calculation Mithridates had made since boyhood ended at the same conclusion. If Rome digested Bithynia in peace, Pontus would live the rest of its life surrounded, waiting for some future Murena or Aquilius to arrive with a pretext. He was now around 60 years old. He had a Roman-drilled army, a full treasury, an ally in Armenia, friends among the pirates, and a lifetime of evidence about what Roman friendship was worth. Rome, for its part, he was still fighting in Spain and was about to face the slave uprising of Spartacus in Italy itself. If there was ever going to be a moment, this was the moment. In 73 BC, Mithridates marched west into Bithynia, and the Third War began, the war that would consume everything. Rome's answer was already moving toward him. His name was Lucius Licinius Lucullus, and he was about to hand Mithridates the most instructive defeat of his life, not with a battle, but with a supply ledger. Chapter 10. Lucullus at the gates. The Roman who now enters our story was famous, in later centuries, for dinner parties. The name Lucullus became a Roman byword for luxury, for gardens and banquets, and later Roman tradition even credited him with bringing a celebrated variety of cherry tree westward from this very war. History has never quite forgiven him the banquets. But before the banquets, there was the war. And in the war, Lucius Licinius Lucullus proved himself one of the most intelligent commanders Rome ever produced. He did it. At the start, almost without fighting. Understand what Lucullus was looking at when he arrived in the east in 73 BC. Mithridates had struck first, and struck well. His new model army had poured into Bithynia. His fleet had won an engagement at sea. He had bottled up a rash Roman commander. Lucullus's colleague Cotta, inside the city of Chalcedon, and then swept on to besiege Cyzicus, a strategic city on the Sea of Marmara, whose loyalty to Rome blocked his path. The ancient sources describe the Pontic force in enormous numbers, well over 100,000 men in some accounts. And while such figures deserve the usual caution, everyone agrees it dwarfed anything Lucullus commanded. Rome's other armies were busy with Spain and Spartacus. Lucullus had 5 legions, perhaps 30,000 men. A conventional general would have marched to Cyzicus and offered battle, and against those numbers he might have lost Asia in an afternoon. Lucullus instead asked a different question, and it is the question that defines his whole campaign. Not, how do I defeat this army? But, how does this army eat? The answer was, with great difficulty. A host that size consumed grain by the shipload. Autumn was turning to winter, and the Pontic supply lines ran back along a coast where storms ruled the sea. So Lucullus did not attack. Plutarch tells us he seized the high ground and the roads behind the besiegers, and settled in to besiege the siege. The king's army lay wrapped around Cyzicus. The Roman army lay wrapped around the king, and hunger, the oldest general of all, went to work for Rome. What followed through that winter was one of the grimmest campaigns in ancient literature. The city would not break. Its defenders held with the courage of people who remembered exactly what had happened to Rome's friends in 88 BC. Outside the walls, the Pontic camp starved by degrees. The sources describe soldiers eating pack animals. Then worse. Disease walked through the tents. Think of that camp at night. In the rain off the Marmara, tens of thousands of fires burning low to save fuel. The horses gone silent, then gone. An army the size of a city, dying of arithmetic. When Mithridates finally accepted the numbers and ordered a retreat, the withdrawal became a catastrophe. Rivers swollen with winter rain caught the retreating columns. Lucullus's legions caught them at the crossings. And the ancient accounts describe tens of thousands lost at the rivers, Rhindacus and Granicus. The great army that had opened the war was destroyed. In effect, without a single pitched battle. Storms wrecked much of the fleet. The king himself, at one point in the ancient telling, escaped across the water aboard a pirate ship, trusting his life to the very outlaws he had befriended in the quiet years. The lesson of Cyzicus deserves a heartbeat of silence, because Mithridates certainly gave it one. He had built a Roman-style army, and it had not been enough, because Rome's real weapon was never the sword. It was the unglamorous mastery of roads, grain, and time. Lucullus had understood that a man fighting a factory should not attack the products. He should cut the power to the building. Lucullus now carried the war into Pontus itself, and the Green Kingdom of our first chapter finally felt Roman boots on its river roads. Yet even in collapse, Mithridates showed why Rome feared him. He raised new forces. He fought delaying actions in the valleys. Near Cabira, his cavalry won engagements sharp enough to make Lucullus cautious. But the pattern of hunger and pressure repeated. Treachery reached into his own camp. And when the end came, around 71 BC, it came as a rout. The king fled with a small escort. And the sources record a detail that tells you everything about how well he understood men. To slow the Roman pursuit, Plutarch tells us, a mule loaded with royal gold was turned loose in the road, and the pursuers stopped to gather the coins while the great prize rode away. What happened next divides into two stories, one of conquest and one of horror. The conquest was Lucullus reducing the cities of Pontus one by one. Amisus, Sinope itself, the royal strongholds of the interior. The horror belongs to the royal family. Mithridates, before escaping east, sent orders to the palace where his household sheltered. His sisters, wives, and concubines were put to death, by poison and by other means, so that none would fall into Roman hands and be marched through a Roman triumph. Plutarch records the scene, including the words the tradition gives to his queen Monime, who had once bargained hard for the crown of Pontus, and now, in her last moments, cursed it. We have seen this pattern since the second chapter of our story, and here it reaches its darkest form. The house of Pontus consumed its own. Whether this killing of his own household was cruelty or mercy, as ancient kings understood mercy, is a question antiquity itself could not settle, and we will leave it unsettled in the dark. Mithridates, now a king without a kingdom, rode east over the mountains to the one door that would open. His son-in-law Tigranes of Armenia, the alliance sealed some 3 decades earlier. Tigranes was now the greatest monarch of the East, styling himself King of Kings. Ruling from a new capital he had named Tigranocerta, the city of Tigranes. He kept his father-in-law waiting at a distance, honoured but unused, for many months. But when Rome sent an envoy demanding the fugitive, Tigranes refused. Pride, kinship, and the insolence of the Roman demand all pointed the same way. Armenia was in the war. Lucullus did the audacious thing again. In 69 BC, without authorization from the Senate, he marched a small army into Armenia, and beneath the walls of Tigranoceta he met the vast host of the King of Kings. Plutarch attributes to Tigranes, watching the tiny Roman force deploy, one of the most quoted sneers in ancient history. If they come as ambassadors, they are too many. If they come as soldiers, far too few. The battle that followed became a Roman legend. Lucullus led his infantry personally against a hill flanking the enemy's armoured cavalry, and the great army came apart in a single afternoon. The casualty figures the sources claim are absurd, and we say so plainly. The verdict was real. Tigranocerta fell, and the newest empire of the East cracked at its first blow. And then, at the edge of total victory, the Roman machine broke its own general. The two kings did the intelligent thing at last. They stopped offering battle and fought with distance. Winter and cavalry, drawing Lucullus deeper into the highlands toward the old Armenian capital of Artaxata. The legions had been marching and fighting for years, far past any frontier they had signed up to hold. Winter in the Armenian mountains did what no Pontic army had done. The soldiers refused to go on. Political enemies in Rome, worked in part by the money of the very tax interests whose abuses Lucullus had tried to rein in, and the sources are explicit about this, stripped his command, province by province, agitators in the camp, including a young officer named Clodius, fanned the mutiny. Lucullus, undefeated in the field, watched his army dissolve in his hands, and Mithridates, who had spent this entire war losing, now did the thing that made him immortal in the history of comebacks. Around 68 and 67 BC, he re-entered Pontus with a small force, and near Zela his reconstituted army fell on the Roman garrison force under the legate Triarius and destroyed it. It stands as one of Rome's worst defeats in all the Mithridatic wars. As Lucullus withdrew, everything he had conquered in 8 years came unspooled, and the king stood again on his own soil, 68 years old, grey, scarred, twice ruined, back on his throne. If the traditions about him hold any truth, the old ritual may have followed him through all of it. The small dose, the bitter cup, raised in a tent, in a fortress, in a borrowed palace in Armenia. We have no record of any single morning. What we have is a lifetime of stories insisting that the habit never stopped, through victory and ruin alike. In Rome, the news of Zela landed on a republic that had run out of patience with proconsuls and their long wars. The Senate and people reached, as frightened republics do, for the one man who finished things. They reached for Pompey. Chapter 11. Pompey and the Long Retreat. By the year 66 BC, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was the most celebrated Roman alive, and he had just performed a miracle of organization that made every other command in the world look small. The pirate fleets we met earlier, grown so bold they had raided the port of Rome itself, had been swept from the entire Mediterranean in a single season. Pompey had divided the sea into sectors, assigned squadrons to each, and rolled the pirates eastward into surrender in a matter of months. A problem the Republic had tolerated for decades dissolved the moment it was handed to one man with total authority and a gift for logistics. So when a tribune proposed giving that same man the entire Eastern War, with sweeping powers over provinces, armies, and treaties, the vote was hardly in doubt. Lucullus, meeting his replacement on the road, in a scene Plutarch records with some relish, traded bitter words with him, the old commander calling Pompey a carrion bird who fed on the kills of others. There was truth in the insult. Lucullus had broken the armies and treasuries of both kings. But wars are credited to the men who end them. And everyone on that road knew which name history would keep. Pompey prepared with the thoroughness that was his signature. He came to an understanding with the Parthian Empire further east, so that Tigranes would have troubles on his own frontier and could send no help. He gathered overwhelming force, secured his supply lines, and only then moved into Pontus. Mithridates, commanding perhaps 30,000 men against him, did what he had learned in the hard school of Lucullus. He avoided battle, stripped the country before the advancing Romans, and fell back toward the Armenian border, betting on distance and hunger one more time. It very nearly worked, but Pompey was not a man to be starved out. And the end, when it came at night, near the place afterward named Nicopolis, the city of victory. Pompey's army occupied high ground along the king's line of retreat. The ancient accounts, Plutarch and Appian among them, describe the Roman attack falling on the Pontic camp in darkness, with the moon low at the Romans' backs, so that the legionaries' long shadows reached the enemy before the men themselves did. And the Pontic soldiers struck at shadows, while the swords arrived from farther away than their eyes told them. Ancient battle descriptions love such details, and we should allow for artistry in the telling. The result needs no artistry. The last field army of Pontus was annihilated in the dark, and the king cut his way out with a handful of riders. Now watch what a lifetime of preparation looks like when everything else is gone. Mithridates rode east with a tiny escort, reached one of his mountain treasure fortresses, and took what could be carried. And there, the sources tell us, he distributed poison to the companions who remained, so that no one who stayed with him need ever fall into Roman hands alive. However we judge it, it is the whole character of the man in a single gesture: foresight, control, and the old familiar chemistry, offered now as a kind of terrible kindness. The door to Armenia, this time, was closed. Tigranes had a rebellious son in Roman company and troubles enough of his own, and he refused his father-in-law refuge. Even, Appian says, setting a price on his head. The king of kings then made his own peace, walking into Pompey's camp, laying his diadem at the Romans' feet, and receiving back his ancestral kingdom as a client of Rome, minus his conquests, plus an indemnity. Tigranes had read the New Age correctly. For the kingdoms of Anatolia and Armenia, survival increasingly meant finding a place inside Rome's expanding order. He died an old man, in his bed, still a king. Keep that ending in mind as you listen to what follows. It is the road Mithridates refused, because the old king was doing something no one, least of all Pompey, expected. He was going north. Trace the route slowly, because it may be the most extraordinary journey in this entire story. From the borders of Armenia, north to the river Phasis in Colchis, the old land of the Golden Fleece, where the mountains of the Caucasus come down to meet the sea, then along that wild eastern shore of the Black Sea, mile after mile, through country that Roman maps marked with the names of tribes and little else, the Heniochi, the Achaei, peoples who lived beyond every empire, in coves and forest valleys, some of whom let the column pass for gifts and promises, and some of whom had to be fought. Winter quarters in Colchis, then onward, around the whole top of the world as his sailors knew it. He was around 70 years old. He had been a king for more than half a century, and he was travelling far beyond the regions where Rome was accustomed to pursuing its enemies, along shores where no legion could easily follow and no fleet could easily watch. Somewhere on that march, with the sea on his left hand and the mountains on his right. The last campaign of his life took shape in his mind. His destination was the Cimmerian Bosporus, the northern kingdom, on the Straits of Crimea that he had won as a young man, where his son Machares ruled as viceroy. Machares had made his own arrangement with Rome years earlier, when his father's cause looked finished. The sources differ on the son's exact end, whether by his father's order or his own hand. But he did not survive the reunion. The old pattern of the house held to the last. And there, at Panticapaeum, the fortress city on the straits at the edge of the steppe, the king who had lost everything 3 times began, unbelievably, to build a 4th time. The ancient accounts describe him conscripting armies from the peoples of the north, arming slaves and freemen alike, taxing the grain cities harshly, and turning over in his mind a plan so audacious that historians have argued ever since about whether it was vision or fantasy. He would not wait for Rome in Crimea. He would march west, around the great arc of the Black Sea, gather the warlike peoples of the Danube lands, cross the mountains, and descend on Italy from the north, as Hannibal had once come, but from the other side of the map. Could it have been done? Almost certainly not. And we should say so honestly. The distances were vast, the coalitions unstable, and his own exhausted subjects wanted no part of it. But Pompey, the sources note, took it seriously enough to blockade the northern grain routes, and Rome slept less easily, knowing the old man was still upright somewhere beyond the sea. Perhaps that was the truest power he had left. He had become proof that Rome could be fought for a lifetime, and as long as he breathed, the proof stood. He had outlived every ally, most of his children, and 3 complete ruins of his life's work. What he could not outlive was the lesson his own family kept teaching, the lesson of the banquet hall in Sinope, where our story began. The last enemy was not marching from Rome. It was already inside the walls, and it carried his own blood. Chapter 12. The Cup That Failed. The end began, as the beginning had, with a conspiracy at court, and this time the conspirator was the son he trusted most. Pharnaces was not a rebel by nature. The ancient sources describe him as the favoured son, the intended heir, the one child groomed to carry the dynasty forward. But look at the Bosporan kingdom through the eyes of its people in the year 63 BC, and through the eyes of that heir. The old king was preparing a march on Italy that almost no one believed in. The grain cities were being taxed to the bone for it. Sons of nobles were being conscripted. Slaves were being armed. Roman ships were choking the sea lanes that fed everyone. Pompey stood victorious in the south, offering terms to every ruler who bowed. To the people around Pharnaces, the choice may not have felt like loyalty against betrayal. It may have felt like a future inside the Roman world, against a war of extermination waged from beyond the edge of the map. A plot formed around the prince. It was discovered, as plots around Mithridates always were. Appian tells us the conspirators were seized, and the evidence pointed plainly at Pharnaces. And here, the king, who had executed sisters, wives, sons, and friends across a 50-year reign, did something that has puzzled readers ever since. He pardoned him. His favourite son wept, embraced him, and was forgiven. That same night, the sources say, Pharnaces went to the army. Why the pardon did not hold, we can only guess, and the ancient writers guessed too. Perhaps the prince judged that a father's forgiveness had the shelf life of his next dark mood. Perhaps the plot was simply too far advanced to stop. Whatever the truth, Appian tells us Pharnaces went first to the camp of the Roman deserters, the exiles who had served Mithridates for decades and who had the most to lose from a doomed Italian campaign, and he won them over. Then the fleet came over. Then contingent after contingent. The sources describe them hailing the sun as king. The sound rolling through the camps at Panticapaeum in the dawn, unit by unit, until the old man on the height could hear his own army crowning his child. Mithridates sent messengers down to his son, asking for safe passage. Appian records that they returned with no answer at all. Picture the citadel in those hours. The high fortress rock above the straits. The water flat and bright to the horizon. The roar of the camps below, rising and falling like surf. 60 years of empire had narrowed to the width of a wall, and the man on it had run out of kingdoms for the fourth and final time. What happened next comes down to us in slightly different tellings. And as we promised at the start of this night, we will give you the tradition honestly, rather than smooth it into a single scene. The fullest account is Appian's, and it goes like this. Mithridates withdrew to the upper citadel with the last people he trusted. Among them, 2 of his daughters. Appian names them Mithridatis and Nyssa, and says they were promised in marriage to the royal houses of Egypt and Cyprus. The king drew out the poison he had always carried, in Appian's telling, in the hilt of his sword, the final reserve of a lifetime of preparation. His daughters demanded to drink first, and would not be refused. The poison killed them quickly. Then the king drank, and walked briskly to hurry the drug through his body. And the poison that had just ended his children would not end him. We should pause here and be honest about how to read this moment, because it is the most famous scene of the entire story, and the sources themselves are its only witnesses. The ancient explanation is the one this whole night has been building toward. Cassius Dio states it directly, that the king had so fortified himself against poison over the years that it could not master him. It is the perfect ending, almost too perfect, and historians have noticed that too. Some modern writers, Adrienne among them, have argued that parts of the scene are physiologically possible. An old man with a hardened tolerance, a limited dose shared among 3 people. Others suspect the ancient authors shaped the scene for its terrible irony. The evidence is far too thin to diagnose what happened on that rock 2,000 years ago, and we will not pretend otherwise. What can be said is that the principal surviving accounts agree on the essential irony. The poison failed, and the king was left standing among his dead. Appian gives him last words, spoken to the one loyal man still at his side, an officer of his Gallic guard named Bituitus. The speech Appian records is the king's whole life gathered into a handful of lines, that he had long foreseen every poison and guarded against every poison, but had never guarded against the deadliest poison of all, the one found in every royal house, the treachery of army, children, and friends. And so he asked Bituitus for the service of a sword. The Gaul gave it. By Appian's account, the hand of Bituitus ended the life that Rome had spent 30 years and countless legions failing to end. Cassius Dio preserves the tradition with a different close, in which the weakened king could not finish the act alone and died under the blades of the men who had turned against him. The 2 versions disagree on the hands. They agree on everything that matters. He died in the citadel above Panticapaeum, in the year 63 BC, at roughly 72 years of age, by steel and not by poison, trying, even at the very end, to deny his enemies control over his death. He had reigned for 57 years. He had fought Rome under Sulla, under Murena, under Lucullus, under Pompey, across the span of an entire Roman generation. Roman writers themselves remembered him as one of the greatest kings their republic had ever fought. Even his enemies kept his legend. Far to the south, Pompey was in camp when riders arrived from the north. Plutarch describes the scene. The messenger's spear tips, wreathed in laurel. The army called together. The announcement that Mithridates was dead, and the roar that ran through the legions. As if, the sources say, 10,000 enemies had died in one old man. Pharnaces sent his father's body to Pompey, along with hostages and a plea for the kingdom. And here, the story delivers one last, quiet turn. Pompey, the sources tell us, declined to look upon the corpse, averting his eyes and sending the body onward, saying the quarrel of Rome was with the living. He ordered the king buried at Sinope, in the rock tombs of his ancestors, with royal honours, at Rome's expense. The wheel had turned all the way around. The boy from the banquet hall went home to the harbour where he was born, carried there by the enemy that could not kill him. Chapter 13. The Long Echo. Kingdoms usually die quietly. Pontus did not. And the strangest part of this whole story is what refused to disappear. Begin with the map. Pompey stayed in the east for years after the king's death, and what he built there outlasted every battle we have described. Bithynia and the western half of Pontus were merged into a single Roman province. Client kings were seated in a great arc from the Caucasus to Judea, each owing rank and survival to Rome. Dozens of cities were founded or refounded, several named Nicopolis and Pompeiopolis after the victor. Plutarch reports that the eastern settlement raised Rome's public revenues from about 50 million drachmas a year to 85 million, an increase of roughly 70%. And whatever precision we grant those figures, the direction is clear. In a sense, the old king built the Roman East the way a storm builds a seawall. Rome organized that world because one man had proven what could happen when it was left loose. And his blood was not finished with Rome. Pharnaces, confirmed as king of the Bosporus for his betrayal, waited 16 years. And when Rome fell into civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar, he did precisely what his father would have done. He crossed the sea and seized Pontus. Caesar, fresh from Egypt, marched against him in 47 BC and destroyed his army at Zela, on ground where Mithridates had once beaten Rome. It was after this battle that Caesar sent to Rome the dispatch that became one of the most famous sentences to survive from the ancient world. 3 words in Latin. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Caesar was boasting of speed, and to Roman ears, that boast may also have carried an obvious, unspoken contrast. 5 days for the son, where the father had cost the Republic decades. The kingdom itself did not vanish with Pharnaces. This is the part most retellings skip. And since we promised you the whole history of Pontus tonight, it deserves its minutes. Rome did what Rome usually did with a difficult frontier. It appointed a king to hold it. Around 37 BC, Mark Antony gave the throne of Pontus to a man named Polemon, the son of a wealthy orator from Laodicea. He was not of the old dynasty. He was a Roman appointment, and he governed the Black Sea coast as a client of whoever held power in Rome, which meant he served Antony, and then, after some careful diplomacy, Augustus, he fought his own campaigns in Crimea and died there around 8 BC, in the very country where Mithridates had made his last stand. What followed is one of the more remarkable stories of the Roman East, and it belongs to a queen. Polemon's widow, Pythodorida, ruled Pontus in her own right for roughly 4 decades. Strabo, our friend from the first chapter of tonight's story and a man of that country, writes about her with evident respect, describing a capable ruler who managed her kingdom prudently through the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius. And through her the old blood returned to the throne by a side door, because her grandmother, by the usual reconstruction, was a daughter of Mark Antony, and her marriages and her children's marriages threaded the Pontic royal line back into the ruling houses of Cappadocia, Thrace, and Armenia. The kings and queens of the Roman East were, by this point, a single tangled family, and Pontus sat inside it. Her descendant held on. A grandson, remembered as Polybius II, ruled the Pontic kingdom into the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, and then, around 62 of the Common Era, under the Emperor Nero, the arrangement simply ended. The client kingdom was retired, and its territory absorbed directly into the Roman provincial system. Its coastal fleet folded into the imperial navy. There was no battle, no Sieg, no last stand. A clerk's decision in Rome finished what 4 legions and 30 years of war had failed to finish in the time of Mithridates. The kingdom by the sea became an administrative district, and the political history that began with 6 horsemen fleeing a warlord ended, roughly 360 years later, with a signature, but the king himself slipped into the world's bloodstream by another door entirely. And this is the part of the story you may already carry without knowing it. His name became a word, Mithridatism, the deliberate building of tolerance through repeated small doses, is a term still found in the literature of toxicology, coined from his legend. The reality behind the word, as we saw in the middle of the night, is narrower than the legend. Real for some substances, useless or worse for others. And no ancestor of modern medicine's carefully studied therapies. But the word survives, and words are their own kind of monument. Few human beings have ever turned a private fear into a permanent entry in the vocabulary of science. And his antidote outlived empires. After his death, the tradition holds. His notes on poisons and remedies fell into Roman hands, and Pompey had them translated. Pliny the Elder, writing a century later, records the formula tradition and, with some skepticism, the enormous list of ingredients attached to it. The compound called Mithridatium gave rise to a whole family of related preparations. Above all, the famous theriac. And those preparations were manufactured, prescribed, taxed, and argued over across the Roman world. Then the medieval world. Then the Renaissance. Apothecaries in Venice compounded theriac in public ceremonies, so that no one could accuse them of cutting corners on the recipe. Rulers kept it against assassination. Preparations descended from the Mithridatium, and theriac traditions remained in European pharmacopoeias into the 1700s and lingered in some pharmacies into the 1800s. We should be precise about what that means. Not one unchanged formula sold for 19 centuries, but a long family line of medicines that kept his name and his idea alive at the counter of the apothecary, generation after generation, while the empires around them rose and fell. Did any of it actually work as advertised? Almost certainly not. And the physicians of the Enlightenment finally said so out loud. But for close to 2,000 years, human beings, facing an invisible threat, reached for the recipe of the man who was said to have faced it longest. His name had become a shape for a hope, the hope that death can be studied. Dorset, and held at the door. The poets found him last. In 1896, near the end of his collection, A Shropshire Lad, the English poet A.E. Housman set a poem about a king who ate a little poison with every meal, so that when his enemies finally struck, nothing on earth could surprise his body. Housman turned the ancient story of the king's tolerance into a philosophy of endurance. The world's bitterness, taken in small doses, against the day of the great grief. And he closed it on 5 words that readers have been quoting ever since. Mithridates. He died old. Most of them never learn the history underneath. The real fortress. The real daughters. The real cup. The poem does not need the history. But tonight, you have both. So what do we actually hold at the end of this long night? Now that the story is told, not a hero. The graves of 88 BC, the drowned families of Adramyttium, the poisoned queens of his own household, stand against any simple admiration, and we have kept them in view the whole way. Not a monster, either. Or not only that, because the tax-gatherers of Asia and the ambitions of men like Lucullus stand in the record just as plainly. What we hold is something rarer than either. A man who was told, by the greatest power on earth, to obey or be destroyed, and who answered, for 30 years. With a third option, no one had offered him. And we hold the lesson of the cup. He spent his whole life armoring himself against the death he could name. And against that death, if the old accounts tell true, the armor held. Poison never killed him. What reached him in the end came from the directions no dose can guard. Sans ambition. An army's exhaustion. The slow verdict of time. He had armored himself against everything except being human. The fortress above the straits is silent now. The harbour at Sinope still fills with fishing boats under the same green mountains. And somewhere in the rock above the old capital, the tombs of the kings of Pontus look out over the water that once belonged to them. The cup was raised at the beginning of our story. Set it down now. Empty. On the stone. He drank everything the world could pour, and he died old. Thank you for spending this night in the Kingdom of Pontus. The sources we leaned on tonight: Appian, Plutarch, Justin, Cassius Dio, Strabo, and Adrienne Mayer's book, The Poison King, are all waiting for curious readers. And if a moment of this story stayed with you, a name, a battle, a question you want to follow further, the comments are open. Rest easy. The Black Sea keeps its stories,